This is Christy, and we have merchandise. Go to howtolovelitpodcast.com and check out amazing t-shirts, mugs, stickers. If you love great quotes, we have some of our favorites. If you love silliness, check out our mascot, Brain Man. Go to howtolovelitpodcast.com, click on the shop button, and find something for that person who needs to be reminded that we are fashioned creatures but half made up. Mary Shelley said that.
Hey, you know what would make your customer service help desk way better? Dumping it and then switching to Intercom. But you're not quite ready to make that change. We get it. That's why Finn, the world's leading AI customer service agent, is now available on every help desk. Finn can instantly resolve up to 80% of your tickets, which makes your customers happier and gets you off the customer service rep hiring treadmill. Finn by Intercom, the leading customer service AI agent, now available on every help desk.
Owning a home is a dream come true, but keeping it comfortable? Temperature Pro understands that your HVAC system is the heart of your home's comfort. When it needs attention, you deserve service that's fast, transparent, and reliable. More than just a repair company, they're your home's partner, offering professional service that respects your space and your family. For routine maintenance or an unexpected breakdown, trust Temperature Pro to keep your home running smoothly with no surprises on pricing. Temperature Pro, your comfort is our promise.
The new Boost Mobile network is offering unlimited talk, text, and data for just $25 a month for life.
That sounds like a threat.
Then how do you think we should say it?
Unlimited talk, text, and data for just $25 a month for the rest of your life?
I don't know.
Until your ultimate demise.
What if we just say forever?
Okay.
$25 a month, forever.
Get unlimited talk, text, and data for just $25 a month with Boost Mobile forever.
After 30 gigabytes, customers may experience slower speeds. Customers will pay $25 a month as long as they remain active on the Boost Unlimited plan.
Hi, I'm christyshriver, and we're here to discuss books that have changed the world and have changed us.
And I'm Gary Shriver, and this is the How to Love Lit podcast. This is our second out of 3 episodes discussing Nobel Prize winner Hermann Hesse and his cult classic, for lack of a better term, Siddhartha. In our introductory episode, we introduced Hess as a person, gave a little context on his personal background, the circumstances in his life that took him to the place where he wrote Siddhartha. We introduced the title character, Siddhartha, and we ended on how we recommend approaching the reading of Siddhartha. Scholar Robert Thurman called Siddhartha prose poem of lived philosophy and not a novel, because in some ways the rhetorical aims and the literary strategies of the book are very different from a traditional novel. And the more we open our minds to the experience Hess has for us, the more we can enjoy the book. Or, to use Peter Elbow's terminology, as we also discussed, the more we can dwell in the book. So, Christy, with that introduction, what is our reading goal for this episode?
Well, if you're reading the book with us, this episode will cover part 1, which is chapters 1 through 4, as well as the very first few pages of part 2, the part where Siddhartha crosses the river. You know, while the first section is 4 chapters, the second section, as Hess divided it, is 8. I mean, the whole thing is very short. My edition only has 108 pages, which, by the way, is the Rika Lesser translation. And of course, many, as you referenced, don't call it a novel at all, but a prose poem. So I want to take a second before we talk about the story itself to talk about translated text. I know we've talked about this before on the podcast, but it's important when you read translated text to consider the fact that you are reading something written in a different language, and the diligence and the skill of the translator's translation impacts your understanding of the ideas that the author was trying to convey in the original language. I mean, in many cases, it can, well, I would say in all cases, it can make or break the experience for you. In Hesse's case, you know, there are several translations now that are reputable, and you may be reading a different one than the one we're reading, and unlikely how you see a few things may be different from our perspective of the story. But Rika Lesser, the translator that translated our copy, she herself is a poet. And perhaps maybe that's the reason why she really respected, as do a lot of people, the poetic aspect of the book. I mean, she tried to understand and translate not just the meaning of the words, but the prosody. How did it sound, and how does that impact understanding? I mean, she's written on the experience of translating Hess, and she's discussed the experience of listening to the German words as she would do over and over again out loud in order to understand in her mind the rhythm. What was Hess trying to create with his word order, with his speech patterns? Lester reminds us that Hess called Siddhartha a piece of Indic poetry. So for her, that means that this is about moving body and the body's breath. Lesser feels the way the book reads should reflect this intent that Hess had in the original.
So you're saying she chose words and ordered her sentences and used commas and other punctuation marks to recreate an oral reading of the story that makes it sound like we're moving or breathing in certain ways.
Correct, because that's what she says Hess is doing in the German. So it's nice to think that she chose to bring something of the mystic experience to her English language readers as best she could through the tools of selected words and punctuation and syntactical patterns to reflect the concept of movement, which really is at the heart of what Hess is trying to convey with his original storytelling in the German.
Of course, we all know when we read English versions of translated texts that they are translated, but most of us don't really think about really the complexity of that process. And we kind of envision a person sitting down and transcribing word for word, like the way Google Translate would do, which, of course, we know it doesn't work because we've all tried to do that. But the actual process involves really getting into the mindset of the artist, and it's tedious and thought-provoking and very demanding. It's a very human process and not a mechanical one. In my personal experience with it was going with you to Brazil, and you would translate Portuguese to English, and there were times you would have to go, there's not a word for that. There's not a word for it. Or it sort of means this, and I'm looking for an equivalent. So it's not a one-for-one thing.
Right. I mean, that's exactly right. And this is especially true when you're talking about philosophy or poetry or anything, simply beyond directions to put furniture together. Although I will say, in March of last year, when my daughters went to Portugal for spring break, they bought me a book, and it was in English. Well, it was in Portuguese, but it was a translation from English to Portuguese of Shakespearean sonnets, which really surprised me that such a thing would even exist. I guess I knew that it did, but I'd never read any of them. And I was amazed at how the translators, they did the same thing. They were trying to preserve the iambic pentameter, the rhyme scheme, doing what in Portuguese Shakespeare was doing in English. I can't even imagine how hard it would be to try to get that right.
I can't imagine either. So many layers you're trying to work into
I know.
To that. But don't think computer-generated translated directions are easy to follow either, even if it wasn't. I've put together many toys and pieces of furniture in my day that seem to have had directions that were written by a computer. And anything from IKEA, too. And I wanted to break the toys before I was done trying to understand the directions and put them together. So translating is hard, and Google Translate for sure has its place on a trip to a foreign country, and it's certainly imperfect and certainly not artistic. But while we're on this topic of translations, I want to point out that it was that first English translation, the one by Hilda Rosner that came out in 1951. It had no preface, no introduction, no information about the author, nothing, but it still inspired the beatniks and the hippies of the 50s and the 60s, and it was the only translation for almost 50 years. So for a very long time, English readers read Siddhartha with zero background information provided, which in some ways makes its success all the more impressive. And I cannot even imagine trying to read a translated work without some kind of background on it.
Well, I will say IKEA uses a lot of pictures, and I have no success putting together. I have no background for that. But I will say this about what you're talking about, it is remarkable. And I think in some ways, well, in every way, it gives testimony to the fact that this book, resonates intuitively with so many people, even without background. But just to finish the story on the translations, because of course we are going to give background. That's the whole point of the podcast. But in 1999, which is significantly later, Penguin Classics, they brought out a new translation by Joaquin Negreshall. And this edition did have what you're talking about. It had a translation. The translator, Negreshall, was and I know I'm not saying his name correctly, I'm sorry, but Negreshall was a celebrated scholar. He's a native German speaker. His translation was highly lauded, and there have been several that come after that. So today we have several very different stylistically in some sense, but very, very different but reputable versions to read.
Well, unlike those early readers, and even though we are not translators or even German speakers, we will provide in this episode some background information on several of the religious aspects of the novel, which I really do think helps me enjoy the story more.
Yeah, because beyond just understanding Hesse's ideas more fully, getting into the setting and the culture, it is an opportunity to explore a part of the world and collect a little bit of a cultural understanding that a lot of us just haven't had an opportunity to do before. We don't read books from this part of the world as often if you're in the West or an English reader. So on that note, let's jump back into our discussion of Siddhartha. Last episode we talked about the first setting of the story, Siddhartha's home among the Brahmins, and we discussed that he was very successful in his native Indian environment. But still, there was this restlessness that he felt in his soul, and it compelled him to leave. And so he does. He leaves with his best friend, Govinda. Govinda, in terms of storytelling from the beginning to end, is a foil to Siddhartha.
Now, foil, that's spelled F-O-I-L, and it's a literary term. Just by way of reminder, tell us what is a literary foil. It's not the same as aluminum foil or the tinfoil hat that you wear sometimes.
No, or is it the math equation foil? So there's lots of meanings to that word. It's also a fencing sword. Did you know that? Yes,
I did. It's also a term for air crash. We've got hydrofoil, but don't let me foil your explanation. I can go on with terrible puns. I think there's a couple other ways to use that word, but I'll stop.
Oh, thank you, because I've run out. Anyway, but let's get back to the literary foil. So a foil in literature, unlike the tin foil, is a character. And the purpose of the character is to be a contrast for the whole time to the main character. That's one purpose. Maybe it's not the only purpose of Govinda, but that is one way to think of Govinda. They're childhood friends. Govinda will be in the story and is kind of always a point of reference because their backgrounds are so similar and the way that they would have originally have seen the world is similar. They start out together, but what we see is over the course of the story, they're different and they make different choices and they see things in different ways. Govinda, in many ways, is going to parallel the more traditional choices. He thinks in the way that the people from his culture and his time period, even if they're edgy, if you want to say, they're going to think this way when you consider that cultural background. But even for Govinda, by the end of part one, he will diverge from Siddhartha's path, somewhat, I would say completely emphasizing Hesse's larger point that all of us will have to do something slightly different with our lives. And we really can't make those choices for other people, or those people can't make choices like that for us.
Now, in the next episode, we will see that Carl Jung calls this individuation. But this week, before jumping into the psychological...
I know you're looking forward to that.
Oh, yeah, that'll be a highlight. Well, this week we'll talk about the religious. And I want to make the point that Siddhartha, the character at this point in the story, is living a life that in several ways deliberately parallels the life of Gautama Buddha, the founder of Buddhism, but their life experiences are going to occur in reverse, as if that wasn't complicated enough.
Well, that does need explanation, but let's start there. Let's start with the Buddha. Who was the real Buddha?
You always give me the most involved concepts to summarize in just a few minutes.
I know, but you're good at it, so please keep it concise.
All right, well, let's start with dates. The traditional dates of the Buddha's life are 563 to 483 BCE. And this was an unusually turbulent time because, iron tools and weapons were revolutionizing both farming and warfare. And solid facts about this time are really hard to come by for this time period. So most of what we know about the Buddha came from myths and legends that date to the 2nd century BCE, which is still a long time ago, but a few hundred years after his death. And because of that gap in the record, there are several different versions of his life story. The one I'm getting ready to share is the one most accepted by most of the Theravada Buddhists. So, as we said last week, the Buddha was born Prince Siddhartha Gautama. He was the son of the ruler of the Sakya clan who lived in the northern border of ancient India. Right after his birth, 8 fortune tellers predicted that Siddhartha would become either a universal world-conquering monarch or a fully enlightened Buddha.
Which one would you want to be?
Man, I'd have to think about it. Well, and this distressed his father, who just wanted him to succeed as a ruler. So, to entice his son to stick around home with him, he chose to overindulge his son with all kinds of material possessions. And by the age of 16, Siddhartha was married and he had 3 palaces. He had all kinds of servants and concubines, and tradition said he had no less than 40,000 dancing girls.
Again, is that something you would want to have if you were a ruler? Can you imagine the cheerleading drama? Those dancers?
The palace intrigue would be unending. It might equal cheerleader problems, I'm not sure.
To make a contemporary comparison, of course.
Yes, and I'm sure he didn't even try to manage that. Anyway, for 17 years, Siddhartha gave himself over to pleasure. But then the story goes one day, the prince encountered a decrepit old man, a grievously ill man, a corpse, and then an ascetic. And these experiences caused him great despair. And after that, his palaces no longer pleased him. And he vowed to live the life of a wandering ascetic in a quest for eternal and transcendent truth and something that would provide the answer for aging and sickness and death. And he wandered in northern India for 6 years with 5 disciples. He studied the teaching of great philosophers and yoga masters. He practiced extreme asceticism at times, like living on 1 grain of rice per day. I mean, why bother? And finally, he collapsed and was given up for dead. And then he abandoned his asceticism. So after regaining his health, he sat under a Bodhi tree and resolved not to get up until he found enlightenment. And it was at this point that he confronted the demon Mara, which is associated with death. Siddhartha confronted and defeated hosts of foes and sin against him. And he spent the night in meditation and attained insight on the nature of suffering and how to get it to stop, which is a state called nirvana. It was out of this experience that Buddhism emerges. The core teaching of Buddhism centers around this idea that suffering and death can be overcome only when ignorance and desire are defeated. The teachings at how to do this center around the 4 noble truths. Life's pleasures and satisfactions are ultimately unfulfilling. This dissatisfaction is rooted in selfish attachment and greed based on a wrong perception of self. The deeper purpose and meaning is achieved when the false sense of ego is transcended, and the way to do that is what is called the Eightfold Path.
And I want to point out, the Eightfold Path is not a small thing to do.
I'm guessing there's 8 steps involved. So it isn't. It's right understanding, right intentions, right speech, right conduct, right vocation, right effort, right mindfulness, and right concentration.
I mean, that's doing a lot right.
And that takes a lifetime of discipline. I mean, really, I think the right way of thinking about it is just to think of it as a lifestyle of striving for enlightenment.
I think of it like eating right. Right eating. That should be that's part of it.
Is that where your enlightenment comes from?
That's where I'm striving.
Well, yes, eating actually is a big part of it because that's being mindful about what you put in your body. And there are several schools of Buddhism that are vegetarian, actually. And although the Buddha was not, he ate what was given to him. And anyway, Gautama Siddhartha, or the Buddha, persuaded a few followers to leave the ascetics to pursue a new path, what he called the middle way. So, if we look at the life of the real Siddhartha, we can see that he first experienced extreme wealth, extreme indulgence, extreme pleasure. Then he swung to the opposite and embraced total asceticism. in other words, extreme discipline and extreme deprivation. And it was by going through these extreme experiences that eventually led Siddhartha to the conclusion that the key was neither extreme, but it was the middle way, a life of simplicity but not discomfort. This is how he achieved enlightenment or nirvana. And Buddhist disciples over time also came to experience enlightenment. And this group, which was called the Arhat, or the perfected ones, this little group began to grow first from a few, then to 60, and of course it grew from there. And according to most accounts, Buddha spent 45 years as a traveling teacher, and he was charismatic, and he attracted followers from every social class, and eventually he even allowed women to join him, and his stepmother joined, and his aunt Mahaparajapati became the first Buddhist nun.
Well, of course, in our story, Hess's Siddhartha leads a similar life in that he will vacillate between these extreme ways of living, whereas Hess reverses the order that his character, Siddhartha, experiences these extreme ways of living. Hess's Siddhartha is born a Brahmin, and yes, he comes from a wealthy existence, but nothing like the exuberance you just talked about. Siddhartha of the story experiences the life of deprivation first. Just like the real Siddhartha, Hess's Siddhartha spends time with ascetics, and he's going to master this lifestyle. The word Hess used to describe the group that Siddhartha spends time with is the word samanas, which is a transliteration of an actual Sanskrit word for an actual group that really did live the lifestyle to some degree that he describes in the story.
Correct. The samanas were wanderers. They were homeless men, often dissidents, often anti-Brahmics, who did not believe the Brahmins had special knowledge. And these men wandered the world looking for truth. And they lived by begging for the very little they lived on. And there are several distinct groups of samanas, and the different groups do have different beliefs and practices. But if you ever hear stories about samanas, it's often stories and myths about powers that they are said that they have cultivated.
Ooh, powers? You mean, are we talking magic?
In a way, yes. There are stories about how some of them, through meditation, had such extreme self-control that they could levitate or slow their own heart rate to almost stopping. In Hess's book, he describes Siddhartha putting someone in a trance, that kind of thing. And these men looked like beggars, and they did beg, but they were not ignorant people. And in many ways, they were an impressive, highly disciplined, highly studied group. In the West, it's hard for us to imagine living like this. Not even the most conservative collection of Christian monks live anything close to the sort of extreme lifestyle of intentional deprivation and concentration, and certainly not me.
Well, what we see in our story is that Siddhartha and Govinda lived with the samanas for 3 years. And just like Siddhartha was the perfect Brahmin, he lived the shramanas, and he was going to be perfect in that lifestyle as well. And this is a parallel to the real Buddha. He totally adopted the lifestyle of asceticism, often just like the real Buddha went days without eating. I want to read a passage from the second chapter called Shramanas, and it says this: He walked the path of self-distancing through pain, through voluntary endurance of suffering and vanquishing of pain, of hunger, of thirst, of exhaustion. He walked the path of self-distancing through meditation by emptying the mind of all association. He learned to walk these and other paths. Thousands of times he abandoned his I. For hours and days he abided in the not I. But wheresoever the paths might lead away from the I, their end always led back to the I. If Siddhartha fled the I 1,000 times, remaining in nothingness, in animals and stones, his return was unavoidable, inescapable the hour he would again find himself in sunlight or moonlight, in shadow or in rain, and again was I again. Siddhartha, and again experienced the torment of the obligatory cycle.
And yet, no matter how perfectly he lives, he is not satisfied with the lifestyle that he's adopted, and not for the reason that I wouldn't like it.
Well, I know. He doesn't quit because it's hard or that he misses the creature comforts of his former lifestyle. His problem is that it doesn't satisfy. I mean, that is what he tells Govinda. He says this, let me quote him. What is meditation? What is departure from the body? What is fasting? What is holding the breath? It is the flight from the I. It is the brief escape from the torment of being an I. It is a brief anodyne against the pain and the senselessness of life. The drover of oxen finds the same escape, the same numbing stupor at the end when he drinks a few bowls of rice wine or fermented coconut milk. Then he ceases to be conscious of his self. He no longer feels the pain of life. He is briefly anesthetized. Asleep over his bowl of rice wine, he finds the same thing that Siddhartha and Govinda find when in their long exercises they seep out of their bodies, escaping, lingering in the not I. So he's expressing frustration in this path, not doing for him the things that he thinks it should be doing for him. He can't escape himself, that suffering, even after all these out-of-body experiences, after the trances, after the self-denials, he comes back.
Yes, and for those who know a little about the differences between Hinduism and Buddhism, one point of criticism is that Hess somewhat blends the two religions with his explanations of the I and the not I, which really can't be done. For Hindus, the word freedom means being one with something, where for the Buddhists, freedom means self-liberation. So they are paradoxically almost opposite ideas, but in real life they appear to be similar things. I mean, I know, it's confusing.
Paradox. That's another literary term. I'm glad you used it because it does absolutely describe this book. I mean, a paradox is something that sounds like it contradicts itself on the surface, but the more you think about it, you realize that it does actually make sense, and that's this entire book. However, in this case, I think it doesn't matter as much to Hess. No, it does matter in the real world. I'm not going to say that these are all similar concepts, but for Hess, it doesn't matter exactly what Siddhartha is trying to achieve as much as the understanding that ultimately this idea of nirvana is not achieved. The self-deprivation did not bring him enlightenment, no matter how good he is at it. Siddhartha looks around at the other ascetics, men who have been devoting their lives to this lifestyle, and they can do so much with it. They've accomplished so much, but they haven't accomplished the ultimate goal. They are not experiencing nirvana. So after 3 years, Hess's Siddhartha, like the real Siddhartha, by the way, abandoned the ascetic lifestyle. Except instead of finding a middle way, like the real Buddha does, Hess's Siddhartha is going to pursue a different path, which we will call the way of pleasure. And what triggers this big change, or the beginning of this big change in Hess's Siddhartha, is not a frustration with any person, any aesthetic, or anything that like that, but the advent of the real Buddha. Hess's Siddhartha and Govinda hear rumors of a man named Gautama who had achieved the ultimate goal and was teaching the way. Govinda approaches Siddhartha with the idea that they should leave, and they do. Siddhartha approaches the other samanas to tell them that they're leaving, and they rage. The text reads, quote, "He ranted and raved and reviled them." This scares Govinda, but Siddhartha tells Govinda, and I quote him, "Now I will show the old man that I have learned something from him." And then he proceeds to enchant the older Shramana to the point that the Shramana becomes mute, his arms go limp, he bows several times before them. That's power.
Yes, it's an interesting complication in the story because it doesn't really serve the plot. I mean, Christy, why do you think Hess has Siddhartha do this to the older Shramana? I mean, it seems unnecessary and maybe even a little disrespectful. They could have just left.
I know. I mean, it's a good question, and obviously I don't know, but I do think it somewhat hits on this motif that we see more than once, that mastery doesn't necessarily mean satisfaction. It's the second time already that Siddhartha has achieved everything in a particular way of life and finds that particular way of life wanting.
The incident certainly showcases that he has achieved mastery of self-discipline. I mean, Govinda even says, "Oh, Siddhartha, you learned more from the Shramana than I knew. It is difficult to bewitch the old Shramana. Truly, if you had remained here, you would soon have learned how to walk on water."
Which is an interesting reference, but exactly. Siddhartha's final confession is that it's just not enough. Not even walking on water, which of course is associated with Jesus, but it's just not enough. And this takes him to the encounter with the real historical Buddha, Gautama Buddha. The third chapter of the novel, and we're just going to call it that. I know it's a prose poem or Indic poetry, but the third chapter of the novel is a new setting. It's the third setting of the story. And again, it's a real place, the Jetavana, in the city of Savatthi. Govinda and Siddhartha travel to Savatthi, and they go to what is now a very famous grove to hear the teachings of the Buddha. But Gary, tell us about that place, the city of Savatthi and the Jetavana.
Well, Savatthi is a significant city in Buddhism. In fact, during Buddha's lifetime, it was the sixth largest and likely Gautama Buddha's birthplace. It's where the Buddha delivered many teachings and lived most of the time. The wealthy merchant Hess mentions, who is Anathapindika, how's that for a name?
It's a lot to say.
Yes, Anathapindika was also a real man. He was one of the Buddha's most famous disciples, and he was generous and famous for helping the homeless and the hungry, but he was also famous for building this monastery, and it was called the Jetavana. It was very lavish, and the story of how it came about is interesting. But the bottom line is that Govinda and Siddhartha go to the heart of Buddhism, to the sacred place where Buddha is thought to have been given the majority of his teachings, and the Buddha stayed in Jetavana more than any other monastery.
So basically, they, like many pilgrims, go to the Jetavana, and they're seeking there the teachings of the Buddha.
Correct. It's thought that the thousands of pilgrims went there, and really many still visit this site today.
Well, when Siddhartha, the story Siddhartha encounters the Buddha, he's overwhelmed by him. And he's not really overwhelmed by his teachings. In fact, he says that. He's overwhelmed by his essence. It says this: every joint of every finger of this hand was a teaching that spoke, breathed, smelled of, glistened with truth. Never had Siddhartha so venerated a human being. Never had he so loved a human being as he did this one. I mean, the text further describes the Buddha's voice. Quote, it was perfect. It was of perfect calm. It was full of peace. Gautama taught the lesson of suffering, of the origin of suffering, of the way to abrogate suffering. Whoever followed the path of the Buddha found release. Of course, this message resonates with Govinda. I mean, Govinda steps forward and becomes a disciple of Buddha. Hess's Siddhartha, however, does not. In fact, he wants to leave. Govinda asks Siddhartha if he has found an error in the Buddha's teaching, and Siddhartha says, no, there's no error in the teaching at all. I mean, Hess develops a conversation between Siddhartha and the Buddha, and by the end of the chapter, we see Hess's Siddhartha explaining to the Buddha why he's leaving. He says this: you have found deliverance from death. It has come to you out of your own seeking, out of your own path, through thinking, through meditation, through knowledge, through enlightenment. It has not come to you through teaching. And such is my thinking, O exalted one. No one attains deliverance through teaching. To no one, O most venerable one, will you be able to speak and convey in words what happened in the hour of your enlightenment. The teaching of the enlightened Buddha encompass a great deal. They teach much: how to live righteously, how to avoid evil. But one thing the teachings, so clear and so venerable, do not contain. They do not contain the secret of what the exalted one himself experienced. He alone, among the hundreds of thousands. This is what I was thinking and recognized when I listened to the teachings. This is the reason on account of which I intend to continue my journey. And so the two men are going to go their way. And finally, Hess's Siddhartha says this: it is not my place to judge the life of another, only for myself. For myself alone must I judge, must I choose, must I decline. And of course, this is the reoccurring idea. It's inherent throughout the whole story. This independence of choice. I mean, we saw that in his life. Hess struggled with this as a child. I myself alone must judge. I must choose.
Correct. And this is what Carl Jung calls individuation, learning to embrace all of oneself and becoming integrated as your own person.
And that's when things get messy. And one reason why we can't really think of Siddhartha as a book that's advocating any particular religious doctrine, because the Siddhartha leaves the Buddha. And we see this is rejecting the Buddha's teaching. He basically says it's fine for you, but your goal and my goal, they're just not the same.
Yes, and let's note that there is literally a physical break in the text after this conversation with the Buddha. And according to Hess's biographers, there was an actual break in time between the writing of part 1 and the writing of part 2 in this book.
Correct. A long time, a year and a half. Hess completed part 1 in August of 1920. He's not going to pick up the book again until March of 1922. And the whole second section, which is twice as long, the next 8 chapters, it was done by May, just a couple months later.
Yes, and Hess had come to a standstill as to how to finish the story. Personally, he was struggling with depression and he was undergoing treatment. But also his knowledge and thinking of Eastern philosophy was shifting. Hess's mental health issues were being treated, importantly, first by a disciple of Carl Jung, and then by Carl Jung, the famous Swiss psychologist, who is credited for really creating a lot of analytical psychology.
Yeah, and I don't want to get too distracted on this because we're focusing on the religious elements, but I do think, we need to know, what is analytical psychology?
Sure. Well, it's all about understanding the relationship between your conscious and your unconscious and really finding psychological balance. It's about being self-aware, which you will see as a big point of emphasis in this book moving forward. And Jung was instrumental in helping Hess finish his story. The ideas that drive this story in part 2 are heavily influenced by Jung. Things like individuation and one's shadow, and which is a Jungian term. And Hess would later write that his therapy with Jung helped, and I quote Hess here, "create a space within us in which God's voice can be heard."
It's such an interesting way to say that when you've been a practicing Buddhism, but it certainly denotes there's just going to be a distinct change in the direction of the book.
Right. And it's not that Hess all of a sudden rejected everything he had otherwise believed about Hinduism and Buddhism, because he didn't. But he did reflect on another worldview. During the time he was being treated by Jung, Hess began reading the work of Lao Tzu and was thinking deeply about Taoism, which is a Chinese philosophy.
I know. And there's just so much. There's just so many different things going on in this little book. And we can't obviously discuss all of them in full, but there's a lot of religions represented here.
Well, there is. And if you read the literature about it, you'll see that there are those who consider it a defense of Christianity as well, especially in the end. And depending on how you want to understand this little book, it is a discussion of Hinduism, a defense of Buddhism, and an incorporation of Taoism, and perhaps a reflection of Christianity on top of that. And let's not forget a little bit of psychology from Carl Jung.
I know. But Taoism, I just want to point out, that's a Chinese philosophy, not even from the same part of the world, because the setting's India. But it's associated, most of us associate Taoism. We think of it because we understand the symbol, the yin-yang symbol. It's that circle, it's half black with the white dot in the part of this black section, and the white side has a little black dot in the middle.
Correct.
That's how I think of it.
Well, there is a lot of Taoism in this book, and it does complement Jungian psychology. And Taoism is all about balance, and that's what that symbol means that you were describing. It's the idea that all living creatures must live in balance and harmony with the universe. And another idea of Lao Tzu that we see very clearly in this book is that every act has to be carried to the very end before a real change can take place. And this is exactly what we see Siddhartha doing in each section of the book. If we want to divide it up into 3 sections of 3, which is the most obvious way to divide this little book, in each section, Siddhartha takes on a certainly radically different lifestyle. He doesn't just adopt the lifestyle, he takes it to its most extreme. Then when he gets to the end, he makes a change, which takes him to the new awakened state, if you want to use that word. And it isn't until the end of the book that he really finds a balanced state.
I'm glad you brought up structure, because that takes me to the final literary idea that I wanted to talk about. Let's talk about numbers. So in all great books, authors use numbers and the structure of their story to support whatever main idea they're trying to convey. And of course, Hess is no different. So there are 12 chapters in Siddhartha. And like you said, it can be easily divided up into 3 separate sections. But if there's 12 chapters, that means if you're going to divide it into 3 sections equally, they're going to have 4 chapters apiece. And that's one way of organizing the reading of the book. But let's look at the number 12, because the number 12 is a significant number, and there are 12 chapters. 12, for one thing, it's the product of 3 times 4, and those numbers reoccur in this story in various ways. But the number 12 itself is the number of perfection. And that's not just in Eastern philosophy. The whole world has done that. Think Christianity. Jesus had 12 disciples. Think Judaism. There are 12 tribes of Judah. Think about the clock. You can be a secular humanist. There are 12 hours on the clock each half of the day. The number 12, by the way, can be arranged, and we know this because we've all seen a clock, into a perfect circle. Look at your clock. The circle is the idea that I'm getting at. What bothered Siddhartha about the samanas is that he said that they're walking in circles. He tells Govinda just that. What bothers Siddhartha about the Buddha and his disciples is basically the same thing. He sees enlightenment as an intellectual exercise of walking in circles. He doesn't want that. And when he understands that, he has what Hess calls a moment of awakening. The first section ends with these words: Siddhartha emerged, more I than before, more tightly gathered in. He felt this had been the last shudder of awakening, the final convulsion of birth. And instantly he set out again, starting to walk quickly and impatiently, no longer toward home, no longer to his father, no longer back.
And so ends part 1.
And so ends part 1. But he's not walking in a circle. He's going somewhere different. Part 2 is very different, not just stylistically, but in emphasis. The descriptions are different. The tone is lighter. The language is not as mystical or as heavy from this point on. This transition is emphasized with the introduction of what we will see as the central symbol of the book. And the central symbol of this book, no doubt, is the river. The night that Siddhartha leaves the Jetavana, he sleeps in a straw hut of a ferryman who will take him across the river the next day. During the night, Siddhartha has a dream, and it is a weird dream. Govinda appears to him dressed in his yellow robe. They embrace, but then Govinda is going to shape-shift into a woman. Siddhartha drinks this woman's breast milk, and he becomes intoxicated with it. Then Siddhartha awakes. The ferryman takes him across the river where Siddhartha is going to live a very different lifestyle. On his way over, though, the ferryman gives him advice that we see later in the book. The ferryman tells Siddhartha that he loves the river above all else. He says this: often I have listened to it. Often I have looked into its eyes, and I have always learned from it. One can learn a great deal from a river. He says this: this too I have learned from the river. Everything returns. You too, Shramana, will come back. Now, farewell. Siddhartha is going to have 2 more awakenings, and each one will be near this river. But the next awakening is not going to happen for another 22 years. Before the next awakening, Siddhartha will make his way through sensuality, through gambling, all kinds of physical pleasure seeking. And it's this symbolic river that separates Siddhartha's spiritual side from his worldly side. This river is the divider, we see it here, between the world of the monks and priests to this new world that we're going to explore, which is full of what Hess calls in German Kinderwelt, or children people.
I like that.
I know. In all honesty, that's what we think of as a regular person in the West. And the problem that really concerns Hess the most is that most of us are wrapped up in materialism and materialistic pursuits. That's what makes us Kinderwelt.
That's a pretty crazy dream. I do wonder what Freud would have had to say about that.
Something for sure.
So, and I do want to point out one more thing. We've talked about how Buddhism is a big part of the story, and we even met the father of Buddhism, the Gautama Buddhism. I mentioned how Taoism is a big part of the novel, and we see that in a river and the importance of balance as we progress forward. I want to point out that doesn't mean Hess abandons Hinduism in the first chapter. It also is always present in the story. In Hinduism, there are 4 possible goals of mankind. There's kama, which is pleasure, artha, which is material possession, dharma, which is duty through religious laws, and the highest goal of all, which is moksha, which is redemption. One more set of 4 as we move forward through the story, but these are represented in Siddhartha's 4 companions. Govinda seeks the goal of dharma. In part 2, we meet Kamala that teaches Siddhartha about pleasure, and Kama Swami, who is his mentor in the way of possessions. Siddhartha's final mentor is this ferryman that we just met. We will learn that his name is Vasudeva, and from Vasudeva, Siddhartha will finally achieve redemption. I mean, I know that's a spoiler, but it's just one more religious element of the story.
I've never in my life read a book that tried to pull from so many different traditions as this one. I mean, even though we've tried to introduce as many of them as possible, I do want to end reiterating, a thought that I brought up before. It's not necessary to comprehend the tenets of Buddhism or Hinduism or Taoism or analytical psychology or Christianity to intuitively understand where Hess is taking us in the story. If we read the book and that, I think if we, hyper-focus on those kinds of things, it's possible you could get trapped and you get frustrated just in the dogma. And for Hess, and maybe this is the argument that links every section of the book from start to finish, we need the humility, and it does take humility, to listen to ourselves. As Hess said, to create a space where God's voice can be heard. Because while Hess uses Indian mythology, Indian symbols, Hindu vocabulary, Buddhist settings, his personal concern is spiritual in the sense of understanding our own spirit, the journey to find purpose and meaning in one's life. And that's deeply personal. It's full of trial and error. We watch Siddhartha first look to purpose in teaching to no avail. We're going to watch him look to it in materialism. Of course, that's more traditional here in the West, but what will he find there? Well, we'll see in our next episode. So onward we go, vicariously with him across the river.
Yes, I'd like to throw in one last historical note in summary as we move on. This book is going to come out after his generation has suffered the violence of the Industrial Revolution. They've suffered the violence of World War I. We're going to throw in brand new fields of psychology and people like Jung and other philosophers. It's just a swirling, just tide of new ideas and things that they're trying to account for. So onward we go. We hope you've enjoyed this primarily spiritual and religious discussion as we explored lands and worldviews from places far from English-speaking lands. And next episode, we will finish our discussion of Siddhartha as we look at the final 8 chapters of the book. If you've enjoyed this discussion, please don't forget to like it and subscribe to either our podcast or YouTube channel, depending on how you're listening. Share our podcast with a friend, either through your social media or by texting them an episode. And finally, if you have a minute, please give us a positive review. It's when you share that we grow, and we thank you in supporting us in our mission to make great literature accessible to as many people as possible. So thanks again.
Peace out.
Hey, you know what would make your customer service help desk way better? Dumping it and then switching to intercom. But you're not quite ready to make that change. We get it. That's why Finn, the world's leading AI customer service agent, is now available on every help desk. Finn can instantly resolve up to 80% of your tickets, which makes your customers happier and gets you off the customer service rep hiring treadmill. Finn by Intercom, the leading customer service AI agent, now available on every help desk.
Owning a home is a dream come true, but keeping it comfortable? Temperature Pro understands that your HVAC system is the heart of your home's comfort. When it needs attention, you deserve service that's fast, transparent, and reliable. More than just a repair company, they're your home's partner, offering professional service that respects your space and your family. For routine maintenance or an unexpected breakdown, trust Temperature Pro to keep your home running smoothly with no surprises on pricing. Temperature Pro, your comfort is our promise.
If you're a facilities manager at a university, you know students rely on the cafeteria for breakfast, lunch, dinner, and the occasional late-night snack. So when a dishwasher breaks down and dirty plates pile up, the mess hall can turn messy in the blink of an eye. Enter Grainger. With over 1 million industrial-grade products and fast delivery, the product you need now is never far away. So you can turn that dishwasher back into a lean, clean washing machine. Call, click Grainger.com, or just stop by. Grainger, for the ones who get it done.